My name is Michael, and I thought my life was as close to perfect as anyone could hope for. I had a beautiful wife, Clara, who was the epitome of grace and kindness, and we had two wonderful children. Lily, a bright and inquisitive 8-year-old with her mother's sharp wit, and James, a spirited 6-year-old who had my adventurous streak. Together, we lived in a cozy suburban home where laughter and love echoed through the halls. I worked a steady job in IT, while Clara balanced her part-time work as an event planner with being an extraordinary mother. Everything seemed perfectly in place. Looking back, I should have seen the cracks, tiny fissures threatening to destabilize what I thought was unbreakable. But when life is good, you tend to overlook the small things. That's the problem with perfection. It blinds you to the storms on the horizon. Our lives began to change when Clara attended a community networking event about 6 months ago. She had recently joined a local group for professionals looking to expand their social circles and gain inspiration for career growth. I encouraged her to go. She worked hard and deserved some time outside the house. When she came back from the event that evening, she was brimming with excitement, talking about the people she had met, particularly a man named Victor. Victor was a consultant who'd recently moved into our town. According to Clara, he was funny, charming, and full of great advice. At first, I didn't think much of it. Clara and I had always been secure in our relationship, and I trusted her implicitly. Besides, she always came back to me, didn't she? Victor sounded like another acquaintance, a passing mention in one of Clara's many stories. But Victor was not just another acquaintance. He was the beginning of the unraveling. It started subtly. Clara would casually mention Victor in conversations, telling me about the advice he'd given her on a work project, or how he recommended a new parenting book she thought we should read. I brushed it off at first. Then, one evening, Victor showed up at our house. Clara had invited him over for dinner. She said he wanted to meet the family, and I reluctantly agreed, trying to push aside the nagging discomfort growing in my chest. Victor was everything Clara had described: charismatic, confident, and annoyingly good at making people like him. He joked with Lily and James, dazzling them with stories about his travels and his supposed adventures. He complimented Clara's cooking and even offered me tips on how to tighten up during our casual post-dinner conversation. His tone was light, but there was something in his eyes, a challenge, a subtle dominance, that made my skin crawl. I dismissed it as my imagination. Over the next few weeks, Victor became a more regular presence in our lives. He dropped by unannounced, brought gifts for the kids, and seemed to know just the right way to make Clara laugh. Each time he appeared, I felt a growing unease. But I said nothing. I didn't want to seem insecure or controlling. Clara deserved her friends, and maybe I was overreacting. Still, something about Victor didn't sit right with me. It was in the way he lingered a little too long when hugging Clara goodbye, or the way he talked about modern family dynamics, in a tone that seemed designed to undermine me. I began to see him for what he really was, a man who wanted something that wasn't his to take. What I didn't realize then was that Victor wasn't just a threat to my marriage. He was a threat to everything I had worked so hard to build. And the worst part? He knew exactly how to exploit every crack in our foundation. Victor's integration into our lives wasn't just gradual, it was calculated. From the moment he stepped into our home for that first dinner, he seemed to know exactly how to position himself. He wasn't just charming, he was magnetic, someone who could draw people in without much effort. It became clear he wasn't just befriending Clara. He was inserting himself into every corner of our family. He made an effort to bond with the kids right away, bringing small gifts every time he visited. For Lily, he brought art supplies and complimented her drawings as if she were a professional artist. For James, it was toy cars and action figures, always accompanied by stories of how he'd once owned something similar as a boy. The kids loved him. They hung on his every word and began asking when Uncle Victor would visit again. Watching their excitement made me feel sidelined. Victor was strategic about building rapport with Clara, too. He'd call her at odd hours to offer advice on her event planning projects, Or he'd forward her articles about work-life balance that, frankly, made me feel like he was commenting on my role as her husband. Clara, ever the optimist, didn't see anything wrong. To her, Victor was just a helpful friend who happened to share her passion for career growth. When I questioned his motives, she brushed me off, saying, "Don't be paranoid, Michael. Victor's just being nice. Besides, he's good with the kids." That statement, "he's good with the kids," echoed in my mind every time I saw him interact with them. He wasn't just playing with them or making them laugh. He was trying to build something deeper. He'd offer unsolicited parenting advice, suggesting how I could better connect with my kids. "Kids need role models they can look up to," he said one day, giving me a pointed look. It felt like a slap in the face, but I held my tongue. Victor's presence grew larger with every passing week. He started showing up uninvited, often under the guise of dropping something off or just checking in. One Saturday, as I worked on some overdue repairs around the house, Victor appeared with a toolbox and offered to help. Before I could protest, he had taken over the project, joking with Clara and the kids as if he were the man of the house. Clara laughed at his antics, and the kids cheered him on, oblivious to the growing knot in my stomach. The turning point came when Victor joined us for a family outing. Clara had suggested we all go to the park for a picnic, and without consulting me, she invited Victor along. The day started fine. Lily and James were thrilled to have him there, but it quickly soured when Victor overstepped again. As we played a game of catch with the kids, he casually remarked, "You know, Michael, you should teach James to throw better. A firm hand is what he needs." I clenched my jaw and forced a smile, unwilling to cause a scene in front of my family. But later, as Clara and I packed up the picnic, I couldn't hold it in any longer. "Why does he keep coming around?" I asked her. "He's too involved, Clara. This isn't normal." She looked at me like I'd just accused her of something unforgivable. "Michael, he's just a friend. He's been helping me out a lot. You're being ridiculous." Was I? I began to question myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was letting my own insecurities get the better of me. But deep down, I knew this wasn't just about me. Victor was testing boundaries, and he was doing it with precision. Every joke, every comment, every small act of dominance. It was all part of his strategy to destabilize me in my own home. Despite my growing unease, I didn't push Clara further. I told myself I could manage the situation, that Victor would eventually move on. But I was wrong. Victor wasn't going anywhere. Not until he got what he wanted. And what he wanted would shatter the very foundation of my family. Victor's behavior didn't just irritate me. It started to feel like a deliberate challenge. Every interaction was laced with subtle digs at my authority and position in the family. If he wasn't mocking me outright, he was making sly comments that left me simmering long after he'd left. What made it worse was how seamlessly he masked his provocations under the guise of humor or concern. One evening, as we sat in the living room after dinner, Victor turned to me and said, "Michael, you're so lucky to have Clara. She's a rare gem, isn't she? You must be doing something right to keep a woman like her happy." He laughed as though it were a harmless compliment, but his words lingered in the air like a challenge. Clara, oblivious to the undercurrent, smiled and thanked him. I stayed silent, but inside, I felt the first stirrings of real anger. The incidents grew bolder. During one of his uninvited visits, he walked into the kitchen while Clara was cooking, leaned against the counter, and started a conversation about strong marriages. His tone was casual, but his words were pointed. "You know," he said, "a marriage is only as strong as the bond between the husband and wife. If one partner starts to slack, the whole thing can crumble." I was standing just a few feet away, and I knew the comment was meant for me. Clara, again, didn't seem to notice the jab. The breaking point came during a Saturday barbecue we hosted for some friends and neighbors. Victor, of course, had invited himself. Throughout the day, he found ways to undermine me in front of the guests. When I struggled to get the grill working, he stepped in and said loudly, "Don't worry, Michael, I've got this. Sometimes it takes a real man to handle the heat." The crowd laughed, And though I forced a chuckle, the humiliation burned hotter than the coals. Later that evening, as I sat with Lily and James, Victor made a point of calling me soft in front of the kids. "Your dad's a nice guy, but sometimes you need to be a little tougher to get ahead in life," he said with a smirk. Lily and James, too young to understand the weight of his words, laughed along with him. I felt my grip on the situation slipping further. Victor's behavior wasn't just about me, though. It started to affect Clara in ways I couldn't ignore. He'd find excuses to touch her. A hand on her shoulder, a pat on the back, a lingering hug that felt too intimate. I could see the discomfort in Clara's eyes during these moments, but she never said anything. When I brought it up later, she dismissed my concerns. "Victor's just affectionate," she said. "You're reading too much into it." But I wasn't. Each of these incidents wasn't just a coincidence. They were pieces of a larger pattern. Victor wasn't just a friend. He was testing boundaries, seeing how far he could push before I pushed back. It wasn't long before the kids started looking up to Victor in ways that made me feel invisible. They talked about him constantly, mimicking his phrases and asking when he'd visit again. When I tried to bond with them, they'd compare me to him. "Uncle Victor does it this way," James said one evening when I helped him with his homework. I laughed it off, but the sting was real. Despite everything, I tried to keep the peace. I told myself it was better not to rock the boat, to wait it out and hope Victor would lose interest. But as the weeks went on, it became clear that he wasn't going anywhere. If anything, his presence was growing stronger. What Victor didn't realize was that I wasn't going to let him take what was mine. He was playing a dangerous game, and I was done being the passive participant. He thought he could chip away at my family piece by piece, but he underestimated me. He underestimated how far I was willing to go to protect what mattered most. The kids were the worst part. Not them, but how Victor had managed to wrap himself around their little hearts, becoming a figure they admired, even idolized. For Lily and James, Victor was like the superhero uncle who could do no wrong. He played catch better than I did. He could tell stories that had them laughing uncontrollably, and his promises were always bigger and shinier than mine. At first, I told myself it was harmless. Kids are impressionable, I thought. They'll grow out of it. But it wasn't harmless. It was calculated. Victor knew exactly what he was doing, and the deeper he embedded himself into their lives, the more I felt like a spectator in my own family. It started with the small things. Victor would swing by on random afternoons with gifts that made my efforts as a father feel insignificant. He brought Lily an intricate art set with a dozen colors I'd never even heard of, far outmatching the crayons I'd given her for her last school project. For James, it was a remote-controlled car that left my modest attempts at building model planes with him in the dust. They loved him for it, of course. Who wouldn't? Then there were the outings. One day, without even asking me, Victor picked Lily and James up after school and took them to a nearby ice cream parlor. Clara had casually mentioned it was fine because Victor was helping out while she was busy with a client. When I got home and found out, I couldn't hide my frustration. "He can't just take our kids somewhere without asking," I told Clara. She waved it off, saying, "He's just being nice. It's not a big deal." But it was a big deal. It wasn't just about ice cream or art supplies. It was about control. Every time Victor made the kids laugh harder than I did or earned their admiration with another grand gesture, it felt like he was stealing something from me. My connection with Lily and James, my role as their father, was being chipped away one moment at a time. The kids began mentioning him in their conversations more often than they mentioned me. "Uncle Victor says lions are the strongest animals in the wild," James declared one evening at dinner. "He said he'll take us to the zoo next week." Clara nodded approvingly, and I felt an invisible wall growing between me and my own family. Even worse, the kids started measuring me against Victor. When I tried to help James with a science project, he said, "Uncle Victor would know how to make it cooler." Lily, who used to love baking with me, started comparing my cookies to Victor's tales of gourmet desserts he supposedly learned to make during his travels. They didn't mean to hurt me, but every word, every comparison, was like a needle prick that cut deeper over time. I started avoiding the living room when Victor was over, just to avoid the sight of my kids fawning over him. One evening, I overheard Lily telling Clara, "Uncle Victor's so strong. Do you think Daddy could ever lift that much?" I clenched my fists in the hallway, torn between anger and despair. This wasn't jealousy. It was something deeper. It was a feeling of losing my place in the very family I'd worked so hard to build. Victor was always quick to emphasize how much the kids loved him, too. "You've got great kids, Michael," he'd say with that infuriating smirk. "I'm glad I can help them grow into strong, independent individuals." It was as if he was implying that I wasn't enough, that he was filling a gap I hadn't even realized existed. The final straw came one evening when Lily asked Victor to help her with a school assignment instead of me. It wasn't just that she chose him. It was the way she said it, as if I wasn't even an option. Victor smiled at me with the kind of triumph that made my blood boil. "Don't worry, Michael," he said. "I've got this. You've got enough on your plate." Enough was enough. I had to put an end to this. Victor wasn't just a friend or a helper, he was a threat. And if he thought he could take my place, he was sorely mistaken. I couldn't hold it in anymore. That evening, after the kids had gone to bed and Victor had finally left, I sat Clara down in the living room. My frustration was bubbling over, and I couldn't pretend everything was fine. "Clara," I began, my voice tight. "This thing with Victor, it's gone too far. He's not just a family friend anymore. He's crossing boundaries, and it's affecting everything. Us, the kids, our home." She looked at me, puzzled, then defensive. "Michael, what are you talking about? He's been nothing but kind to us. He's good with the kids, he's helpful, and he's been a great friend. Why are you making this a problem?" I felt my hands clench into fists, not in anger at her, but in frustration at how blind she seemed to be to what was happening. "He's not helping, Clara. He's inserting himself into our lives. He undermines me every chance he gets. He's overstepping, and you're letting him." Her expression softened, and for the first time in weeks, she seemed genuinely concerned. "Michael, are you feeling threatened by Victor? Do you think I'd ever let someone come between us?" I sighed. "It's not about me feeling threatened. It's about him deliberately trying to destabilize things. He's not your friend, Clara. He's something else. And it's not just me who sees it. The kids are getting attached to him in ways that make me feel like I'm being replaced in my own home." She paused, and for a moment, I thought she might finally understand. But then she said something that completely shifted the conversation. "I didn't want to bring this up," she said hesitantly, "but I've been going through something. And Victor has been there for me in ways I didn't think I needed." My heart sank. "What do you mean, something?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Clara looked down at her hands, avoiding my gaze. "I didn't want to burden you, Michael. You've been so busy with work, and I felt like I couldn't talk to you about what I was feeling. It's nothing against you, but I've been struggling with the kids, with my career, with everything." Victor noticed. He listened when I needed someone to talk to. Her words hit me like a punch to the gut. "You could have talked to me," I said, my voice cracking. "I'm your husband, Clara. Why would you turn to him instead of me?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I didn't want to worry you. You've been under so much pressure already. Victor, he made it easy. He didn't judge me. He just helped. Helped." That word echoed in my mind, sour and bitter. Victor wasn't helping. He was exploiting. He'd seen a crack in our foundation and had driven a wedge into it. And Clara, without realizing it, had let him. "I don't trust him," I said firmly. "Whatever you think he's doing for you, it's not innocent. He's not just some kind friend. He has an agenda, Clara, and it's not good." She looked at me, torn between guilt and frustration. "Michael, I hear you, I do. But I don't think he's the villain you're making him out to be. He's just been there when I needed someone. And where was I? I shot back, unable to hide the bitterness in my tone. I'm right here, Clara. I've always been here. The conversation ended there, unresolved and heavy. Clara didn't defend Victor further, but she didn't promise to distance herself from him either. It left me in a limbo of doubt and anger. I couldn't shake the feeling that Victor wasn't just a friend. He was a threat. And Clara, whether she realized it or not, had opened the door and invited him in. That night, I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, replaying the conversation in my head. Clara's admission about her struggles hurt me deeply. Not because she had them. Everyone struggles. But because she hadn't come to me. She'd chosen Victor, a man who clearly wanted more than just friendship. I made a silent vow to myself. Whatever it took, I would protect my family from Victor. Even if Clara couldn't see it yet, he was a danger, and I wouldn't let him win. It happened on what was supposed to be a calm, pleasant afternoon. Clara had decided to host a family barbecue in our backyard, inviting a few friends and neighbors over. Despite the tension between us, I agreed to go along with it, hoping it might restore some semblance of normalcy. I even convinced myself that Victor wouldn't come, but of course, he did. He arrived early, as usual, with his trademark smirk and a cooler filled with fancy drinks he knew would impress everyone. As the guests trickled in, Victor seamlessly integrated himself into every conversation, every activity, every corner of the gathering. He helped Clara set up the tables, played soccer with the kids, and even gave grilling tips to the neighbor who had volunteered to cook. It was as if he'd declared himself the unofficial host of my own event. I tried to ignore him. For most of the afternoon, I kept to myself, chatting with a few guests and playing with Lily and James when I could. But Victor was everywhere. No matter where I turned, he was there. Laughing, joking, positioning himself at the center of attention. And Clara? She didn't seem to mind. She was busy entertaining the guests, her laughter ringing out as Victor cracked yet another joke. It stung more than I wanted to admit. The real blow came as the barbecue was winding down. Most of the guests had left, and it was just a small group of us sitting around the patio table. Clara, the kids, Victor, and a couple of neighbors who were helping clean up. We were all chatting casually when Victor leaned back in his chair and said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "Clara, you've really outdone yourself today. You're amazing, you know that?" Clara smiled politely, but before she could respond, he stood up, walked over to her, and, to my absolute horror, leaned down as if to kiss her on the cheek. It happened so fast and yet so slowly, as if the world had stopped spinning for a moment. I saw Clara freeze, her smile faltering, her eyes darting to me in panic. The kids, sitting just a few feet away, looked on with innocent curiosity, unaware of the storm brewing in my chest. And Victor? He wore that smug, confident expression that had haunted me for months. Before I even realized what I was doing, I was on my feet. My voice came out sharp and loud, cutting through the awkward silence. "Victor, what the hell do you think you're doing?" Everyone froze. The neighbors exchanged uneasy glances. Clara stood up abruptly, and the kids looked at me with wide, confused eyes. Victor, unfazed, straightened up and shrugged casually. "Relax, Michael. It was just a friendly gesture." "Friendly?" I barked, stepping closer to him. "You don't touch my wife, you don't try to kiss her, and you certainly don't do it in front of my kids." Victor smirked, that infuriating smirk that had been driving me insane for weeks. "Calm down, man. You're overreacting." That was it. The last straw. Without thinking, without caring about the consequences, I lunged at him. My fist connected with his jaw, the force of it reverberating through my arm. He stumbled back, more shocked than hurt, but I wasn't done. Months of frustration, humiliation, and helplessness boiled over in that moment. I hit him again, this time sending him sprawling onto the grass. I barely registered the chaos around me. Clara shouting my name, the neighbors rushing forward, the kids crying. All I could see was Victor, lying on the ground, looking up at me with wide eyes. For the first time, the smirk was gone. "Stay away from my family," I snarled, my voice trembling with rage. "If you ever come near them again, I'll do worse than this." Victor groaned, clutching his side, but he didn't respond. The neighbors pulled me back, and Clara stepped between us, her face pale and her eyes filled with something I couldn't quite read. Fear, anger, disbelief. "Michael," she said quietly, her voice trembling. "What have you done?" I looked at her, then at the kids, who were clinging to each other, their faces streaked with tears. Reality came crashing down around me. I had snapped, lost control in front of my family, in front of my children. But even then, a part of me refused to feel guilty. I hadn't just acted out of anger. I had acted to protect them. Victor didn't stay long after that. He stumbled to his feet, muttered something about pressing charges, and left without another word. The party ended in silence, the air thick with tension and unspoken questions. That night, as I sat alone in the living room, staring at the wall, I couldn't help but wonder if I'd done the right thing. I had defended my family, yes, but at what cost? And deep down, I knew this wasn't over. Victor wasn't the type to walk away quietly. The house was eerily silent the next morning, the weight of what had happened hanging heavily in the air. Clara barely spoke to me, her movements stiff and deliberate as she made breakfast. The kids, usually noisy and lively, were unusually subdued, whispering to each other and casting nervous glances my way. I could feel their confusion and fear radiating across the room, and it made my chest tighten. This wasn't what I wanted, for them, for us. The night before played on a loop in my mind. The crack of my fist meeting Victor's jaw, the stunned expressions on everyone's faces, the terrified look in Clara's eyes. I'd acted out of rage, sure, but it wasn't without reason. Victor had crossed a line, one that no man had any right to cross. Yet, sitting there at the breakfast table, I couldn't shake the gnawing guilt. I hadn't just lost my temper. I'd lost control. And in doing so, I'd scared the very people I was trying to protect. "Michael," Clara said suddenly, breaking the silence. Her voice was quiet but firm, her eyes avoiding mine. "We need to talk." I nodded, knowing this conversation was inevitable. "Kids, go play in your room," I said gently. They hesitated, exchanging worried looks, but eventually left, leaving Clara and me alone in the kitchen. She leaned against the counter, arms crossed, and sighed deeply. "What were you thinking last night?" she asked, her tone a mix of anger and disbelief. "You attacked Victor in front of our children. Do you have any idea how that made them feel? How it made me feel?" "I was protecting you," I said, my voice defensive despite myself. "He tried to kiss you, Clara. In front of me. In front of the kids. What was I supposed to do? Stand there and let him?" Her jaw tightened. "You were supposed to handle it differently. Michael, you're their father. You're supposed to set an example, not—" She stopped, exhaling sharply. "Not let them see you like that." I ran a hand through my hair, frustration bubbling under the surface. "Clara, he's been disrespecting me for months, undermining me, trying to worm his way into this family. And you've been letting him. Last night wasn't just about what he did. It was about everything. I snapped, yes, but I did it because I had to. Someone had to put him in his place." She finally met my eyes, and for the first time, I saw something other than anger or disappointment. There was pain there, and guilt. "Michael," she said softly, "I never wanted any of this. I thought Victor was just a friend, someone who could help me through a rough patch. I didn't see what you saw. I didn't realize he was pushing boundaries until it was too late." Her admission caught me off guard. For weeks, I'd felt like I was fighting this battle alone, like she couldn't, or wouldn't, see the threat Victor posed. Hearing her say it now, though, didn't bring me the relief I thought it would. If anything, it made the whole situation feel even heavier. "And now?" I asked, my voice quieter. "Do you see it now?" She nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I do. Last night, when he tried to kiss me. It made everything clear. I'm so sorry, Michael. I let him get too close. I didn't think about how it was affecting you, or the kids, or us. I wasn't thinking. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her it wasn't her fault, but I couldn't. Not entirely. Because while Victor had been the one orchestrating this mess, Clara had let him. She'd let him into our lives, our home, our marriage. And now we were all paying the price. "What happens now?" I asked after a long pause. Before she could answer, there was a knock at the door. Clara stiffened, and my stomach sank. I had a bad feeling I already knew who it was. Sure enough, when I opened the door, 2 police officers stood on the porch, their expressions professional but firm. "Mr. Michael Adams?" one of them asked. When I nodded, he continued, "We need to talk to you about an incident involving Victor Hale. He's filed a complaint for assault." I felt Clara step up behind me, her hand brushing against my back. "Michael," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's okay," I said, more for her benefit than mine. I turned back to the officers, nodding grimly. "I'll cooperate." As they led me to the patrol car, I couldn't help but glance back at the house, at Clara, standing in the doorway with tears streaming down her face, and at Lily and James, peeking through the window with expressions of pure confusion and fear. My heart broke in that moment, but I told myself it wasn't over. Victor might have thought he'd won, but this was far from the end. The police station wasn't the cold, intimidating place I had imagined. It was worse. Sitting there, staring at the peeling walls and the buzz of activity around me, I felt the weight of everything pressing down. I wasn't a criminal, but Victor's accusation had landed me here, surrounded by people treating me like one. My mind raced, replaying the scene over and over. I hadn't been wrong to act, but had I gone too far? After a brief interrogation, they let me go on bail. Clara was waiting outside, her face a mix of relief and fear. We didn't say much on the drive home, but I could feel the tension between us growing thicker. Something had to give, and soon. The next day, Clara received a call from one of her friends. Apparently, Victor wasn't just playing the victim. He was talking to people, spinning the narrative that I was an insecure, violent husband who couldn't handle his wife having a male friend. The way Clara's face crumbled as she relayed the conversation made my blood boil all over again. This wasn't just a feud between Victor and me. He was actively trying to destroy my reputation and fracture my family. But then, a breakthrough. One of our neighbors, a retired journalist named Mrs. Hargrove, stopped by that afternoon. She'd been at the barbecue and had witnessed everything. She leaned in conspiratorially, her voice low. "I don't like that man," she said, referring to Victor. "There's something off about him. So I did a little digging." What she revealed made my stomach churn. Victor wasn't who he claimed to be. His name wasn't even Victor Hale. He'd changed it years ago after being involved in a scandal in another town. Apparently, he had a pattern of ingratiating himself with families, particularly those going through tough times, and exploiting them, emotionally, financially, and socially. In one case, he had driven a wedge so deep between a husband and wife that they divorced, leaving him to swoop in and comfort the wife. When she discovered his real motives, he vanished. Clara looked horrified as Mrs. Hargrove explained. "I knew there was something wrong about the way he acted," she said, her voice trembling. "Michael, She stopped, tears welling up in her eyes. "I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you sooner." Her apology hit me harder than I expected. For weeks, I'd felt like I was losing her to Victor's manipulations. But now, seeing the guilt and regret in her eyes, I realized how deeply he had played us all. But the most damning revelation came a few days later when a private investigator, hired at Mrs. Hargrove's suggestion, unearthed Victor's true motive for targeting our family. He wasn't just a manipulative con artist. He was someone from my past, a ghost I hadn't even known existed. Victor was my half-brother. I stared at the investigator in disbelief as he laid out the details. My father, a man I'd thought I'd known well, had lived a double life for years. While raising me and my siblings, he'd had another family, one he kept secret. Victor was the son from that family, born out of the lies and betrayal my father had hidden so well. And now, decades later, Victor had returned, fueled by resentment and jealousy. It all made sense now. His calculated charm, his obsession with Clara and the kids, his deliberate efforts to undermine me. It wasn't just about power. It was about revenge. He saw my family as the life he believed he should have had, the life he was denied. And he was willing to destroy everything to take it from me. Clara was stunned when I told her. "Michael," she said, gripping my hands tightly, "we can't let him win, not after everything we've been through." I nodded, a sense of resolve washing over me. Victor might have thought he could manipulate and destroy us, but he underestimated one thing: my determination to protect my family. He had exposed the cracks, yes, but now I was ready to fill them, to make our foundation stronger than ever. The next step was clear. Victor had to be confronted, not with violence this time, but with the truth. It was time to take back control. The revelation about Victor left Clara and me reeling. The idea that he wasn't just a con man, but my half-brother, added a layer of betrayal I wasn't prepared for. I had grown up believing my family was whole, that my father was a man of integrity. To learn about this secret life and how it had come back to haunt me in such a twisted way was devastating. But amidst the chaos, there was one thing I was sure of. Victor would not destroy my family. The days following the revelation were hard. Clara and I barely spoke at first, the weight of everything making it difficult to find the right words. The kids, still shaken from the barbecue and my brief arrest, clung to Clara, their trust in me fractured. Seeing them look at me with fear instead of admiration was a pain I couldn't describe. But I wasn't going to let Victor's poison linger. I started with the kids. Each evening after work, I made a point to spend time with them, reading their favorite books, helping them with homework, and playing games they loved. At first, they were hesitant, unsure of whether to trust the angry version of me they'd seen. Slowly, though, their smiles returned, and they began to laugh and joke with me again. One night, as I tucked James into bed, he asked, "Daddy, why did you fight Uncle Victor?" His innocent eyes searched mine, and I realized I couldn't dodge the question anymore. "Because, buddy," I said softly, "Uncle Victor wasn't being a good friend to our family. He was trying to hurt us, and I needed to make sure he couldn't do that anymore." James thought about it for a moment, then nodded. "Okay," he said simply, and I felt a small sense of relief. He didn't fully understand, but he didn't need to. What mattered was that he knew I was protecting them. With Clara, the process was slower. She carried a lot of guilt, not just for letting Victor into our lives, but for not believing me when I first raised my concerns. "I should have seen it," she said one night as we sat on the couch. "I should have trusted you." "It's not your fault," I replied, taking her hand in mine. "Victor is a manipulator. He knew exactly how to worm his way in. The important thing is that we're still here, together. We'll get through this." We decided to see a marriage counselor, something I'd never imagined needing before Victor came into our lives. Those sessions were eye-opening. They forced us to confront not just the fallout from Victor's actions, but the underlying issues in our relationship that had allowed him to exploit us. Clara opened up about the loneliness and stress she'd been feeling, and I admitted how my own insecurities had kept me from addressing the problem sooner. Through those conversations, We found each other again. The cracks Victor had exposed became opportunities to strengthen our bond, to rebuild what he had tried to break. It wasn't easy, but it was worth it. For the first time in months, I felt like we were on the same team again. We also made changes to our family dynamic. We set clear boundaries about who could be involved in our lives, ensuring that no one could insert themselves the way Victor had. Clara became more open with me about her feelings, and I made a conscious effort to be more present, more attentive. Together, we created a stronger foundation, one built on communication, trust, and mutual respect. But even as we healed, Victor's shadow loomed. The legal proceedings from the assault charges he filed against me were still ongoing, and I knew we hadn't seen the last of him. Still, I felt a renewed sense of strength and purpose. No matter what he tried next, I was ready.